Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by OraSure Technologies. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral fluid-based testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost savings with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates, as well as other drugs of abuse approved for use with the Intercept device. It was ranked as the #1 recognized brand name in oral fluid testing by a 2014 National Drug Testing Industry Survey. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, the clinical setting screening programs, among others. Today's presentation is entitled, How to Improve Your Drug Testing Program with Lab-Based Oral Fluid Testing, and will be presented by Bill Current and Jennifer Lopez. Bill Current is the president and founding partner of the Current Consulting Group and the publisher of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He is the author of 10 books on substance abuse-related issues, including the popular title, Why Drug Testing? CCG is a leading provider of drug testing policy writing services, working with companies to help them optimize their drug testing ROI. Bill is the former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education and vice president of consulting for Employee Information Services. Jennifer Lopez has worked in community corrections for the past 23 years, serving as Deputy Chief of Chester County, Pennsylvania Adult Probation and Parole since 2008. In 1999, she began coordinating the operation and management of the Adult Drug Court in Chester County and was active in the expansion of treatment courts to a post-conviction adult drug court, mental health recovery court, and veterans court. She has successfully written grants that have afforded over $6 million to establish programs that benefit addicted offenders and offenders suffering with mental illness. Ms. Lopez serves on the Mental Health and Justice Advisory Committee and the Criminal Justice Advisory Committee at the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. Ms. Lopez has served on committees for the administrative offices of the Pennsylvania courts, including drug court accreditation, guidelines for the implementation of veterans treatment courts, and statewide performance measures for adult drug courts and drug court management information system. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current and Jennifer Lopez.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome to everybody who has logged into today's webinar. I'd first like to just acknowledge once again OraSure Technologies for hosting this series of monthly webinars, and it's been our pleasure to be associated with quite a number of them this year. And this is really important. There's just so much information that needs to be shared in whether you're in criminal justice or you're the workplace or treatment, et cetera, whatever your specialty is. If you're involved in drug testing, there's so much information that needs to be out there because there's a lot of misinformation. And so my hat's off to OraSure Technologies for putting on this monthly series of webinars. Jessica referred to a survey in which the OraSure brand was ranked as the #1 recognized brand name in oral fluid testing. That's a survey of drug testing providers. So among laboratories, manufacturers, third-party administrators, medical review officers, et cetera, they recognized the OraSure brand as the #1 recognized brand in lab-based oral fluid testing. And even though they don't offer an instant oral fluid testing for the workplace market, they were also, their brand came up as the #3 recognized brand in that category. So that just shows you the strength of their brand. So we're really happy to be associated with them. And I'm also excited today to be presenting with Jennifer Lopez. Jennifer has a wealth of experience in the criminal justice field, as you can see from her resume. She really has an impressive resume, and I had a lot of trouble sort of cutting parts out. There's just a lot more to it, and she's had a very impressive career. And in particular, among various areas that she's an expert in, she has expertise in trauma. And trauma is something that that can be triggered by lots of different things, but if not handled right, a drug test can actually trigger trauma with that client that you're working with if you're in the criminal justice field. And so she's going to talk about that a little bit later in today's presentation. I'm really looking forward to that. We're going to basically sort of follow the outline that we used in the invitation to today's webinar. We know that, for example, drug abuse trends are headed in the wrong direction. The latest study from the federal government that comes out every year shows that, again, for the probably fourth or fifth year in a row after some years of leveling off, the levels of drug abuse, the magnitude of the problem has increased. And of course, criminal justice professionals are aware of this. They deal with it every day. Drug testing is intended to help prisoners, parolees, and others who are in the criminal justice system. Sometimes, to stop using drugs can be a very challenging thing. Even though it may be required of them, even though they're going to be subject to drug testing, they're going to buck the system. They're going to look for ways to cheat on the drug test if they can. And lab-based oral fluid testing presents a viable option. If you're used to doing urine drug testing, for example, lab-based oral fluid testing represents a viable option that sort of counters some of the sort of inherent flaws with a typical urine testing program. Now, I say that as somebody who's been in the drug testing industry for 25 years now. I'm a proponent of all types of drug testing, including lab-based urine testing, instant urine testing, hair testing, and especially lab-based oral fluid testing for a number of reasons, which I'm going to sort of share and go into in detail in today's webinar presentation. But the point I want to get at is that drug testing, when done right, regardless of the specimen, regardless of the method, whether it's lab or instant, can achieve very positive objectives. It's got to be done right. Under certain circumstances, for example, and I think the criminal justice field is probably a good example, lab-based oral fluid testing may be a good fit for some of the challenges that you typically face trying to achieve the objectives of a drug testing program. So we're going to follow this outline. We're going to talk a little bit about some federal government statistics. We'll get into some crime statistics related to substance abuse, and then we'll talk specifically about different areas of oral fluid testing. I'll hand the ball off at one point to Jennifer, and she's got a separate set of slides which we'll switch to, and we'll go through her presentation as well. You'll see how I think the two really merge and fit together well. And then any questions that you have, please bring them up. Use the Q&A section there in the to the right of your screen to ask any questions that you have. If we don't get to your questions today, and that seems to always happen, we get too many questions and we can't get to them all, we'll respond to it afterwards. You'll also have access to our slides as well. So if some of the statistical slides I'm going to show you, I'm going to sort of breeze through a little bit because it's a lot of dense copy, but I wanted you to have the information. So the information's in the slides. We're going to send you a link afterwards, not only to the recording of today's webinar presentation, but also to how you can access the slides themselves if you'd like to use them for your own purposes. So there's a report that comes out every year from the federal government, National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It's been in existence under different names since the 70s, and it's the best indicator that we have on an annual basis of the levels of drug abuse taking place in the United States. So from the 2013 report, which was released in 2014, it's always a year later, there were over 24 million Americans who admitted to being current illicit drug users in the 12 or older category. Now, the government defines a current illicit drug user as someone who, during that survey phone call, and that's how they do it, they do a phone call and they ask you a bunch of questions about being a drug user. But during that survey phone call, they ask you, when's the last time that you used an illicit drug? And if it was at least once in the last 30 days, then you are categorized as a current or past month illicit drug user. If it was once in the last year, but not in the last 30 days, then you're a past year drug user. And then beyond that, you're considered once in a lifetime, or at least once during your lifetime drug user. Now, that 24.6 million is significant. It's almost 9.5% of the population 12 and older. But the government did a study of the study. In other words, they did a study to find out how accurate this survey is from year to year, and they determined that the results from the survey, the ones that I'm sharing with you, are at least 1/3 lower than what really is the case. So 1/3 of 24, of course, would be another 8 million. So we're looking at over 32 million probably as the more accurate figure for past month or current illicit drug users. Keep that in mind as we go through these statistics and these numbers. They're probably even higher. Now, I threw in some numbers about drug abuse and employment because I know in the criminal justice field, oftentimes that's either a requirement, a goal, or objective to help your client get into some type of gainful employment. 22.4 million current illicit drug users, 18 and older, so these are adults, about almost 69% were employed either full or part-time. So the majority of current illicit drug using adults have a job. Among adults 18 and older who were unemployed, the rate is 18.2% being current illicit drug users. The rate of, and this is kind of a repeat of the previous slide, but if you go to the second bullet there, 21.5% of current illicit drug users were employed either full or part-time. That's the total number there. And then this next slide is really sort of interesting. This breaks down the drug abuse by drug category. And this is important. I want to point out something here that is significant. Because if you're going to do drug testing, you've got to be testing for the right drugs, or there are going to be flaws in your program, and it may not achieve the objectives that you have. Marijuana, we know, is the #1 drug of abuse, 19.8 million, 7.5% of the population. And I do entire webinar presentations on medical marijuana and recreational marijuana laws. We're not going to get into all of that today. It's tempting. I could go that direction, but we're not going to do that. But the #2 category of drugs of abuse is prescription drugs. That's the #2 category. It comes before cocaine, it comes before hallucinogens, inhalants, and heroin. Now, we're seeing an increase in heroin abuse throughout the country, and in certain parts of the country in particular. So we suspect that by next year's report, which will reflect 2014, heroin numbers will go up. Okay, that's unfortunate, but that's the trend that we're seeing. It's not reflected necessarily in this data. But prescription drugs, which include sedatives, tranquilizers, etc., that's the #2 category of drug abuse. So if you're testing for a typical 5-panel of drugs, which a lot of employers in the workplace market test for, marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, and heroin, and then PCP, you're going to miss the #2 category of drugs of abuse. You're not testing for the oxycodones, the hydrocodones, or any of those drugs. And that's a significant percentage and number of individuals who are captured in this report who are using those drugs in an illicit manner. In other words, if you're a prescription drug user, you're not counted in this category. It's only those who are abusing prescription drugs, using another person's prescription drug, using a prescription drug without a prescription, using it in a manner other than how it was prescribed to be used. And if you keep in mind that the numbers are maybe as much as 1/3 lower than what they really are, then that 6.5 becomes about 10 million. So it's a significant problem. It's a growing problem. Cocaine used to, for many years, was the #2 category of drug abuse under marijuana. Now that family of prescription drugs, the oxys, the hydros, etc., are #2. Again, I point that only because you got to be testing for the drugs that people are using, or you're not going to achieve the objectives of your program. Now, I've got a bunch of slides coming up on drug abuse and alcohol abuse among criminals, among people who are in the criminal justice system. I'm not going to go through all of them. They're here, though, for you to peruse afterwards when you get the slides. I do want to point out a few things. So this is a report from the Bureau of Justice Services. 17% of prisoners and 18% of federal inmates said, they admitted, that they committed their current offense to obtain money for drugs. And about 26% of the victims of violence reported that the offender, in their opinion, was using drugs or alcohol at the time of the offense. 41% of violent crimes committed against college students and 38% against non-college students committed again by somebody perceived to be using drugs. In the workplace, 35% of victims of violence in the workplace believe that their offender was drinking or using drugs at the time of the incident. And as you can see in that second subset of bullets there, it depends on the occupation of the person giving the report as to whether or not they thought the individual was using drugs or under the influence of alcohol. But that's an interesting perspective, as you saw let me just go back to it real quick. The law enforcement professional had probably a more keen perception of the use of drugs by the offender or the criminal. Now, alcohol is not reflected in those illicit drug use figures that I showed you earlier, but the same report, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, includes information about alcohol abuse. And so, remember I said that a current illicit drug user is somebody who admits to using illicit drugs at least once in the last 30 days. We've got that in here. It's called binge drinking. It's sort of the equivalent. A binge drinker, that second bullet there, is somebody who admits to having at least 5 drugs on at least one occasion in the last 30 days. And you can see that nearly 1/4, 23% of people 12 and older, fall into that category. The third bullet are heavy drinkers. These are individuals who admit to having at least 5 drinks on at least 5 occasions in the last 30 days. The percentage, of course, is going to be lower, but it's still a significant percent, 17 million people 12 and older. And if you go into the website, which you're going to have that link there that you can use later, you'll see that it breaks it down by age categories, by gender, by employment, by all educational background, etc. And here's just a little bit more on that, but let me skip that so we don't get bogged down too much on that. I do want to show you the breakdown by occupations because, again, I think this is pertinent to the criminal justice professionals who are in today's webinar. So heavy alcohol use, again, that's at least 5 drinks on at least 5 occasions in the last 30 days. You see where roofers, and this is occupations, the study shows it by industry, so you could have construction as one industry. But I broke it down by occupations here and pulled it out. So you can see at the bottom you've got cooks at 11.9%, but up at the top you've got roofers at 25.7%. Now, if you're like me, you don't like to get up on the top of a house anyways and stand on the roof. You certainly don't want to be there under the influence of alcohol. But that is the occupation that has the highest percentage of admitted heavy alcohol users. Again, if that 25.7% is a third less than what it really should be, then we're really looking at over 33% of roofers being heavy alcohol users, followed by electricians, carpenters, carpet floor tile installers, finishers, construction laborers, etc. It's not until you get down to the 15.2%, that's the food and beverage servers and other people who are in the food services industry. Below that, retail sales, and then general sales, 14.6% in sales manufacturing, in the manufacturing and wholesale industries, and then, as I said, all the way down to cooks at 11.9%. Of course, there are a lot of occupations that aren't listed here, right? But if they're not listed here, that means they're below 11.9%. But this is significant. Sometimes individuals who are working their way through the criminal justice system, trying to come out on the other end, you know, rehabilitated and gainfully employed, are going to find work sometimes in these professions, in these occupations. And so this is important information to know. The individual you're working with may be making every effort in the world not to drink anymore, but in certain occupations, they're going to be exposed to individuals, in certain occupations at a higher rate, they're going to be exposed to individuals who are drinking heavily. Now, I've got a few slides coming up on more specific alcohol abuse and crime and drug abuse and crime. And again, I'm not going to read them all to you, but let's go through a few of them. Fact, 5.3 million adults, 36% of those under correctional supervision at the time were drinking at the time of their conviction offense. The Department of Justice estimates that most criminal offenders were under the influence of alcohol alone when they committed their crimes. And federal research shows that about 40% of convicted murderers being held either in jail or in state prison are involved with alcohol use as a factor in the homicide that they've been accused of. Alcohol is a factor in 40% of all violent crimes today. And as you go down below, violent crimes are rapes and sexual assaults, robberies, aggravated assault, and simple assault. But those are pretty high percentages right there. Alcohol has a significant role in crime. There's just no question about that. And again, the people on today's webinar, majority of you, are well aware of that. So I'm going to skip through some of these. I do want to point out that third bullet there, 70% of alcohol-related incidents of violence occur in the home with greatest frequency at 11 p.m., 20% involving a weapon other than hands, fists, and feet. DWI-related issues, we won't go into a lot here, but you know those statistics are very high. There was a study that came out recently that I did not include in today's presentation that showed that the rate of marijuana-related traffic fatalities has tripled in the last 10 years. Tripled to the point where it's almost equal to the rate of alcohol-related traffic fatalities. And so, it was kind of an interesting study. It showed the results where these results are tracked in 8 different states. And of the 8 states, 6 of them already had legal marijuana laws on the books, and another one of the 8 had just passed a law. So their statistics wouldn't have shown necessarily any impact from the new legal marijuana, the medical marijuana law in that state. I don't have that with me today to show you the list, but where marijuana has been legalized, we're seeing an increase in traffic fatalities related to THC. And it's beginning to get to the point where it's comparable to alcohol-related traffic fatalities. And these are just a little bit more here. The second bullet, 40% of state prisoners convicted of violent crimes were under the influence of alcohol at the time of their offense. Again, probably statistics that you may be aware of. Most inmates are in prison at least in large part because of substance abuse. 80% of offenders abuse drugs or alcohol. Nearly 50% of jail and prison inmates are clinically addicted, and approximately 60% of individuals arrested for most types of crimes test positive for illegal drugs at the time of their arrest. And I'm just kind of, these are great numbers, and I think it's all fascinating. But just to make sure that I don't take up too much time and we don't get to Jennifer's part, let me skip ahead a little bit here to the drug testing section. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been in the drug testing field for about 25 years now. I'm a proponent of all types of drug testing. There are times when one testing method is definitely going to be more advantageous than another. But it behooves you as professionals in the field to know the different options that are available to you, because drug testing works. It's proven to be a powerful weapon as a deterrent to drug abuse, as a way of identifying people that need help, and lab-based oral fluid testing is an alternative worth considering. It's popular already in the criminal justice field. I can tell you in the workplace market, very popular in the hospitality industry, in the grocery industry, in the construction industry, very popular overseas in other countries where they don't really sort of have this, 30 years of lab-based urine testing culture, and so they're more open to alternatives like hair testing and oral fluid testing. And so you find in countries like Australia, for example, oral fluid testing is the drug testing method of choice. It's actually a method that's required in certain industries. But there's some things about oral fluid testing you have to know. And there are a lot of myths floating around about oral fluid testing, about the accuracy, whether or not the window of detection is long enough to get the positive rates that you want to look at. Some of the information that's pertinent these days with the marijuana situation is whether or not you can detect marijuana or THC in an oral fluid test. And the answer is yes, but I'll get to that. And then the whole issue about being able to cheat on a drug test. We all know that urine testing is susceptible to cheating. That's just an ongoing problem, and you're dealing with that on a regular basis. I'm going to touch on that in the next few minutes with these slides. So when it comes to accuracy, it's important to know that oral fluid mimics blood when it comes to being able to detect drugs in an individual system. So the presence of the drugs, as it says there in the underlined part at the top, is usually related to the amount of drugs in the blood system or in the bloodstream. And that makes an oral fluid sample equivalent to a blood sample when testing for drugs. With oral fluid, you can detect both the parent drug and the metabolite of the drug. So the parent drug is the drug itself. That's the best way to think of it. And the metabolite is a metabolic breakdown of the parent drug. Well, with urine testing, you're only going to detect the metabolite with most urine testing methods. With oral fluids, you're going to be able to detect both the parent drug and the metabolite. Because you can detect the parent drug before it's broken down metabolically, you're going to be able to detect drugs in a person's system very accurately and very quickly. So, I've got some slides coming up on the window of detection. I'll save that for a moment. But when looking for an oral fluid testing product or system, ask for this kind of information. Ask for empirical independent data that backs up the accuracy claims of the provider of the system. Definitely, when at all possible, look for an FDA-cleared device, collection device, and testing system in the laboratories. Which assays, which drugs are FDA cleared in the laboratory? That gives you your greatest sense of security and comfort with the testing system that you're using if you're dealing with an FDA cleared collection device for that saliva sample, and you're also testing for assays in the laboratory that individually, as drugs, have been FDA cleared as well. So you can be testing for 50 different drugs. That's an overstatement, but a lot of drugs. But the ones that are FDA cleared is where you get that level of confidence. And so you want to ask which drugs are FDA cleared with your testing system. Ask for referrals, do your own research, ask for the package insert so you can study it and put it to the test. And, be careful who you're doing business with, because in today's drug testing world, there are a lot of different providers out there that maybe don't have the track record to back up the services that they're providing. Now, I mentioned window of detection. Window of detection is very important, and the window of detection typically with oral fluid testing is shorter than it is with urine testing and certainly with hair testing. But the question you want to ask is, when is the window of detection open and when does it close? Okay? This is significant when it comes to lab-based oral fluid testing. I'm not talking about instant oral fluid testing, the type of device that gives you a result within minutes. I'm talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, which is typically considered a little bit more stable when it comes to the window of detection. So this chart demonstrates the window of detection for 4 different samples: blood, oral fluid, urine, and hair. You'll notice, remember I said oral fluid is the equivalent of blood for this purpose. Because you can detect the parent drug, you're going to see that drug in that sample faster than you will with urine and certainly with hair. The window of detection is going to open up almost immediately after the individual has used the drug. So let's say they're out in the parking lot smoking a joint. If you collect an oral fluid sample 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, whatever, within minutes, it's most likely going to pick up that THC and you're going to get a positive result. But with urine, as you can see, the window of detection lag time is about an hour or so for THC. So it's going to be a little bit longer, give or take 10 or 15 minutes. But if it's 10 minutes after usage, you're probably not going to get a positive unless the guy is a chronic marijuana smoker and he's always got THC in his system. You're going to get positives on the front end of the window of detection with oral fluid that you would miss with urine. On the other hand, as you go farther out, you're going to see that the window of detection closes sooner with oral fluid than it does with urine. Now, let me say one thing about hair. You'll notice the window of detection doesn't open up for several days, but it extends for several weeks, about 90 days altogether. So depending on what your objective is with your drug testing program, you may want a hair testing program because you want that 90-day, lifestyle view. But if you're looking at testing people as they come into your office and they're being tested by an officer, you may be more interested in the most recent drug use indicator, and that would be either blood or oral fluid. Blood typically impractical and expensive for this testing scenario, so oral fluid would be the way to go if that's your objective. You're still getting a lab-based result with lab-based oral fluid testing, but you're getting the advantage of that earlier window of detection. Now, the positivity rates are very, very similar for lab-based oral fluid testing and lab-based urine testing for the same period of time. In other words, you're still going to get some positives on the front end with oral fluid that you miss with urine, but you're going to miss some with oral fluid on the back end of that window of detection that you will get with urine. But in between, the positivity rate is almost identical. I mean, again, it depends on the testing system that you're using. Here's a study of over 4.5 million test samples with the OraSure Intercept device. But think of that middle column there as lab-based oral fluid testing. It happens to be the oral fluid Intercept device. The overall positivity rate, a little bit lower with lab-based oral fluid testing than with urine testing, but as you can see, most of it's right there on that next line with amphetamine. That's where the difference is made. In all the other drug categories, as you scan down, comparing the middle column to the right column, the positivity rate is higher or slightly higher with lab-based oral fluid testing. So 4.1 to 4.4 overall, but depending on the drug, you're going to get more positives with oral fluid testing. Look at the THC line there. THC being the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, 2.5% positives versus 2.3% positives with lab-based urine testing, or I should say urine analysis. So this myth that you can't detect THC in an oral fluid sample is not accurate. You can, but there's a big difference between testing methods. So if you're talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, you're going to get the kind of results that I just showed you in that chart. With POCT, point of care or point of collection testing devices, the ones that issue or give you an instant result, with oral fluid, you're probably not going to have that level of positivity rate, not that accuracy. And part of it is because of the big part is because of the cutoff levels. So if you're looking at a testing device that has a cutoff level for THC of 50 nanograms per milliliter or higher, as you can see, that's everything to the right of that vertical red dotted line. You're not going to get the type of positives that you're hoping to get, because the majority of THC positives, as you can see, are to the left of that line. In fact, they're way down there below 20 nanograms per milliliter. That's where the majority of THCs are detected. If you're testing at a higher cutoff level than 20 nanograms per milliliter, and certainly 50 nanograms per milliliter for THC, you're going to miss a lot of positives. And that's the difference between lab-based oral fluid and instant oral fluid. It just depends on what your need is, what your objective is. But if you're concerned about THC positives, then you need to know what the levels are for what the cutoff level is that you're dealing with. Now, let me just say quickly, as far as drug test cheating goes, most of the problems simply go away when it comes to lab-based oral fluid testing. That's just common knowledge in the drug testing industry. The oral fluid collection is 100% observed, matching gender between the administrator of the test and the donor. That all goes away. We're not dealing with bathrooms. We're not dealing with all of the precautions that we normally take with the urine testing program. The opportunity to switch samples, to adulterate a sample, all of that very much goes away when it comes to oral fluid testing. And when I did a little bit of research on the internet, finding, there are really literally hundreds of thousands of websites that offer advice on how to cheat on a urine drug test. But when it came to advice on cheating on an oral fluid drug test, the best one I could find was to avoid submitting saliva. Don't let them have your saliva. As it says down there at the bottom, between these periods of time, ingestion up to 24 hours, it says, between these periods of time, you must avoid being screened or you will surely test positive. I have another one. I didn't have time to put it into the slide, but there's a company that offers a mouthwash. You're supposed to be able to rinse your mouth with this product, and you're going to get a positive, or you're going to get a negative result, even if you've been using drugs recently. But very key to their program, it says, for this product to work, make sure you stop using drugs at least 24 hours before being tested. Voila. There's the proof in the pudding. Now, I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Jennifer now. We'll come back with a little bit of conclusion. I see we've got some questions in the hopper already. But Jennifer has real-life experience in the criminal justice field with drug testing, dealing with the trauma aspect of criminal justice in general, and how drug testing can trigger that trauma. So I'm going to pass the ball to Jennifer, and Jennifer, you now have the microphone.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. We are going to shift directions a little bit after Bill's insightful overview of substance abuse and oral fluid testing. So I'm sure, let me get to the right slide here. you are wondering why we're talking about trauma. What does it have to do with substance abuse? What does it have to do with testing? And the simple truth is that understanding trauma can really help you do your job better and can make doing your job easier.
Jennifer, let me interrupt you for a second. If you'll just click on your name up there at the top.
Okay.
It should bring up your slide deck. So there's a tab there that says Criminal Justice. There you go.
Okay, thank you. So what we know is that when you increase your understanding of trauma, when you're aware of the impact that trauma has on behaviors of our clients, and ultimately when you develop a trauma-informed response to those behaviors and to your clients, it's going to increase your safety, it's going to reduce recidivism rates among your clients, and ultimately promote recovery. In the trauma field, we call these the 3 R's. It's recognize, realize, and respond. We want to recognize the prevalence of trauma, realize that impact that it has on behavior, and understand our response to those behaviors. So let's start getting into the details. We need to know, who are we talking about? How many of my offenders or clients on my caseload have trauma? How often might I have to use a different approach when I'm dealing with my clients? So first we're going to look at trauma in the United States, and you can see on this slide that there's a high prevalence of trauma. 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 7 boys experience sexual abuse, 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence, and then 10 to 20% of children are exposed to that domestic violence as well. 17% of adult women experience sexual assault, 22% of teens witness a shooting. In the United States, there's over 16,000 homicides each year, and for each homicide, 7 to 10 close relatives or loved ones are affected or traumatized by that homicide. And we see high rates of multiple victimizations. So someone that was abused as a child ends up in a relationship where they experience domestic violence. So the trauma builds layer upon layer. According to the National Violence Against Women survey, there's more than 300,000 women that are raped each year and almost 93,000 men. When we look at the criminal justice population, the trauma rates are very high for both men and women. It's twice the rate among defendants as the general population. We see a lot of youth with trauma, twice as high for women. We began a women's supervision unit in February of this year, and in surveying the women, 96% of them have multiple traumas in their history. To further explore the number, there are a couple studies that have been done. This was men and women with co-occurring mental health and substance abuse. Current trauma was defined as within the past 12 months, exposure to violence, physical assault, or sexual assault. So when you look at this, 96% of women and 89% of men, that's not a big statistical difference. If you're a statistician, the rates are very similar. What's really shocking is that for 3/4 of these men and women, the victimization is ongoing. So this study illustrates that there are very high levels of trauma among our population, and that trauma is not necessarily in the past. It may be ongoing. So these studies also make it safe for us to make an assumption, and that is that everyone coming into the criminal justice system has a history of trauma. So we encourage criminal justice practitioners to take universal precautions, to just make the assumption that someone that you're dealing with has a traumatic history. This is another study that was done among 311 mental health court participants across 3 states. And it's got a little bit more specific about sexual abuse or rape, parents hitting or throwing things at them, beating with a belt, whip, or strap, hitting them with something hard, beating them or hurting them with their hands, or being injured enough to need medical attention. Again, we see very high rates of child physical abuse, similar between men and women, and again, high rates of current traumatization. This quote is sadly true for trauma survivors, and for some, this is because the trauma is ever present. They're still dealing and living with the effects of trauma, and for others, it's because victimization continues. The past is never dead. It's not even the past. We now see that we can make that assumption that there are very high rates of trauma among our population, and that's that first R that we talked about. We're recognizing the prevalence of trauma. Next, we want to come to the realization of the impact that trauma has on behavior. We know that trauma can affect both mental and physical health. It increases the risk for substance abuse, and combined with that substance abuse, it can contribute directly to criminal behavior, and ultimately it influences the interactions and responses that our clients have to services. It influences their ability to respond to treatment and other interventions that we're trying to provide to change behaviors. And we know if we don't address the trauma, it leads to withdrawal from programs and services, inadequate or inappropriate services, relapse, and increased management problems. That's when we see behavioral issues in clients that we have a hard time addressing. And it often, some of the things that we do re-traumatize people. When we don't address trauma, we often see our clients labeled as treatment resistant or difficult. And we want to change that perception. So what is trauma? The origin of the word trauma comes from the Greek word wound. And SAMHSA's been working on surveys to come up with a definition, and this is what they have. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically and emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. A good way to remember this is through the 3 E's. It's the event, experience, and effect. It's an event or experience or circumstance that happens. It's the individual's experience of that event or circumstance, and it's the long-lasting adverse effect on the individual. When we look at examples of trauma, we see, and this is not an inclusive list by any means, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, witnessing violence or a traumatic event, natural disasters, shootings, bombings, a combat situation, a victim of war, accidents, illness, injury, poverty can be traumatic. We see that it can be an actual or a threat of physical or psychological harm. It can be witnessing something, and it may occur as a single event or repeatedly over time. What we have to remember is that it's very individualized to the person. What may be traumatic for one person may not be for another. And when we're looking at our population, we're seeing clients that get stuck. Many people suffer through traumatic events. When you think about 9/11 and the people that overcame and did positive things after that, that moved beyond the trauma and healed, a lot of our populations get stuck in the trauma. Trauma has a pervasive impact on a person's entire being. Pervasive is defined as spreading throughout every part of something. And we see that trauma really overwhelms ordinary systems that give people a sense of control, of connection, and meaning in their lives. It affects both their body and their brain. Today we're going to look at 2 of the long-term effects that relate to drug use and drug testing and a lot of the things that we see with our clients. And we're going to start with behavioral problems. Some of these problems, the substance abuse, the relationship problems with our clients, between us and with them and their families, lying, snap decisions without thought or consequences, perceived threats, defensive aggression. These are some of the behaviors that frustrate us the most in our roles as helpers and agents of change. So remember at the beginning, I told you that becoming trauma-informed will increase your safety. Well, here's where it really comes into play, because someone with trauma history may very often lead them to have a perception of threat, even when there is little or no threat. Some of our invasive procedures in the criminal justice system, taking someone into custody, certainly observed drug testing. If you work in a prison setting where you're doing searches when someone's coming in are perceived as dangerous or threatening. And some of the responses that we see are withdrawal, fighting back, strong emotional outbursts. And it also may lead to defensive aggression, and that's when someone lashes out as a means of self-protection. And they're often acting aggressively, reacting aggressively without even thinking. So we want to shift our thinking to see that these self-destructive behaviors are not character flaws or even symptoms of mental illness sometimes, but they're strategies or behavioral adaptations that people have developed to cope. And this is really the third R, our response. We're shifting that perception of the behavior from out of control and dangerous to seeing someone as threatened, vulnerable, not feeling safe. And that's going to impact the way we respond. Now, this doesn't imply a lack of responsibility for behavior, but it gives us an opportunity to apply approaches that are most effective in promoting recovery and reducing recidivism. So another biggie long-term effect is substance abuse, and Bill touched on this a little bit. And the truth is that drugs work for people with a trauma history. They medicate away the pain of trauma, medicates all those feelings of fear, depression, low self-esteem, anger. It reduces anxiety. It alleviates the feelings of powerlessness and isolation, and it, quite frankly, can help you escape the reality of the situation you're living in. This drug abuse often leads to further traumatization, so it's this never-ending cycle. We also know that there are many effects that people unknowingly seek out with each type of drug. So you want to think about a juvenile that may be being burned by his or her parents, going to look at PCP and Special K because it's a surface anesthetic. You know, they're not going to feel anything, physically or mentally. We see stimulant use. One of the behaviors we see with trauma survivors is hypervigilance, someone who's always on guard, always on alert, scanning the room for danger. Using a stimulant helps you maintain that hypervigilance. So when we use drug testing, you know, we're using it as a therapeutic tool with the client to monitor their sobriety. And when we see a drug test come up negative, it empowers the client and validates their recovery work. When we find someone positive, it gives us an opportunity to address the need for more supportive services, and it also holds the client accountable for his or her actions. What we need to be aware of in our roles as helper is the shift that happens when we start drug testing, especially when you're doing an observed urinalysis testing. That really highlights the power differential between staff and client. And we need to be aware of power and control issues that this procedure can elicit. The client may feel like they're being punished or judged when they're being drug tested. And when someone has had abuse in the past, this witnessed urinalysis can really lead to re-triggering or bringing up old trauma. Think about someone that's been a victim of domestic violence whose abuser has controlled and monitored their behaviors. They may have listened in on phone calls, demanded to watch her dress, shower, use the bathroom. So that observation of the production of a urine sample may decrease the client's feeling of safety and invoked past trauma. You know, think about where we're doing the drug testing. We're usually in a small space. Where are we standing in relation to a client? Certainly with male clients, we're standing behind or to the side, and all of those things can trigger trauma. And this is where that perceived threat comes in. They may withdraw. They may have emotional outbursts. And it may lead to defensive aggression, where they act out aggressively. It may play out that way. You know, we give an example of a client who's had a family session, and they start talking about abuse from her past. And she leaves the family session and just knows she's not going to make it through the night without using drugs. She comes in to see her PO, knowing that she's used, still upset and re-triggered by the memories of the abuse, and refuses to submit to a drug test. So as she escalates and the staff escalate in trying to secure the urine, she becomes aggressive. So when we look at these examples, this is certainly where we want to create a process that maintains the integrity of our testing, but at the same time, the dignity of the person. And oral fluid testing certainly is a way to modify our procedures. But again, we want to remember that sometimes it's how we do something rather than what we do. We want to treat every client as having a trauma history. So we want that universal assumption of trauma. We want to shift our question. The paradigm shifts to what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. And we want to begin to pay attention to our interactions and procedures, because what we do can help make things better or it can make things worse. When we interact with people, these are the trauma-informed principles that we want to incorporate. And I really want to just highlight two in relation to what we're discussing. We want to offer respect, information, safety, choices, and collaboration. We want to give as much information as possible when we're dealing with clients. This really helps to establish that safety, and that safety is both emotional and interpersonal, but also physical safe space. So we want to make sure that we're looking at our environment and our approach. We want to leave a lot of physical space, and that's really a key in dealing with our offender population. We want to provide information, so we want to let them know what's happening, what we're going to do next. And again, this is where oral fluid testing can really help out for a client who's being triggered and having to submit to a test. We also use oral fluid testing in our field work. You know, it's an officer safety issue. We're not having to go in. We can take an oral fluid test on someone's front porch rather than having to go into their home and into their bathroom. This next slide really illustrates for you a trauma-informed approach. So as we're drug testing our clients or meeting with our clients for the first time, we really want to create that partnership. You know, I need to talk to you about your drug and alcohol use, and we may need to talk to you about some uncomfortable things that may have happened. Which would you like to talk about first? You want to offer choice and control. You can take a break at any time. I know this is hard. If you don't want to answer a question, that's fine, but just let me know. You want to advise them of what to expect, especially physically. You want to minimize any surprises and maximize the predictability. At the end of this interview, I'm going to drug test you. That means we're going to go into the bathroom. I'm going to go in with you. I'm going to give you the cup. I'm going to watch you submit the sample. Now, if you know someone's a trauma survivor, if they've shared that, you may want to ask them what triggers them. And that's where you can switch your method of testing. And still with the oral fluid testing, you want to explain what's going to happen step by step. And you want to provide that safe space, again, for your trauma survivors. Now, why learn about trauma? This slide really illustrates the benefit. This was in a jail in Rhode Island that had their entire staff trained in a trauma-informed approach, and you can see the drastic change in management of inmates. Assaulting inmates dropped dramatically, inmate fights, inmate assaulting staff, and use of force stopped. So it's really the benefit of understanding trauma and how we respond to the sometimes frustrating behavior that don't seem to be related to trauma, but in the end are. I wanted to share that this is a really brief overview of a half-day training titled How Being Trauma-Informed Improves Criminal Justice Responses. I encourage you to go on the Gain Center website. There are trainers all over the country. You can get the contact information on this website. If you're in the Southeast region, you can certainly contact me, but trainers are all over giving this training, and SAMHSA currently has a grant available to train trainers in this curriculum. I think the grant application is due December 5th. So with that being said, I think I will turn this back over to Bill.
Perfect, Jennifer. That was great. And while you're passing the ball back to me, let me just share a couple of questions with you. We don't have a lot of time, so if we're not going to have time to get to all the comments or questions today, unfortunately, but I think you'll agree that the information was excellent, and so hopefully you feel like you've been well served today on today's webinar. Jennifer, how common is oral fluid drug testing becoming in your field?
Well, I think we're all certainly trying to expand the tools in our toolbox, and we've been doing it for several years and actually putting grant money to be able to test it at first to see how it worked. And it's our most popular testing method, especially for field-based officers. And I think most agencies, at least in Pennsylvania, are using it to some extent.
So that leads me to the question then, in terms of the clients that you're dealing with, are they surprised when they maybe if they're coming into the office or you show up at their place, are they surprised that it's going to be an oral fluid test?
In the beginning, yes, certainly. Because we have seen all the ways to cheat. We've confiscated more Whizzoniters than I would like to count. And so when we switched to oral fluid and added that to our testing methods, we certainly saw some surprise. But as we know in the field, once we're doing it for a little while, the word gets out. So I think people are pretty much aware. But we mix it up, so it still sometimes comes as a surprise to some clients when they're coming in. But we certainly, we try to take that approach where we're not trying to catch you doing something wrong. We're trying to help you in your recovery. This is just a tool that we use.
And and because we're on the subject of oral fluid testing, we'll kind of just focus on that, but how, from a trauma perspective, and I know you touched on this somewhat, but from a trauma perspective, what are sort of the subtleties of oral fluid testing versus, say, a traditional urine testing program, and does that help to alleviate or reduce the risk of, sort of triggering trauma?
Oh, absolutely. I think when we train in the trauma, part of the curriculum is looking at some of the things that we do that can re-trigger trauma, and drug testing is a big one, especially in probation and parole. So just the simple act of, having to go into the bathroom with someone, having to witness that sample, and of course make sure someone's not cheating, is hard, both for staff and the offender. So when we're doing the oral fluid, you can do it in your own office. There's not a line outside the drug testing room. Everyone's sitting there. And especially if someone is feeling vulnerable or triggered, it's something that we can use. We need to know if someone's using drugs, but we don't want to add to what's already going on if they're distressed. So getting the oral fluid swab certainly meets our needs and helps us to ultimately help the client.
Okay. And we're out of time now, but we did have a number of people who specifically asked whether or not they could have access to your slides, and I don't know if that's something that you want to commit to or not.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Then what's going to happen, I'll turn the microphone back over to Jessica to take us out here, but Jessica will be sending you an email. I'm speaking to the audience now. She'll be sending you an email that will have the link to the recording of today's webinar, as well as how to access both my slides and Jennifer's slides so that you can go through them at your leisure. You can focus on some of the statistics a little bit more. And then if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. We'll also have Jennifer's contact information in there as well. But if there's anything that we didn't get to today, just email us. We'd be happy to respond to it. If it's a question for Jennifer specifically, we'll forward it to her so that she can answer that for you. Thank you again, Jennifer, for that excellent presentation and for the information you presented. And thanks again to OraSure Technologies for hosting today's webinar. We'll now turn the time back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Jennifer. On behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope that you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Today's presentation is approved for 1 credit hour of continuing education from SAPAC for CSAPAs. Please email Jessica Polk at Jessica, Jessica, at billcurrent.com, BILLCURRENT.com. That's Jessica at billcurrent.com if you are interested in receiving that credit. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.